I have never been a superstitious man. I am an architect by trade. My life is defined by load-bearing walls, material physics, and structural integrity. I believe in what I can touch, what I can measure, and what holds weight. But there is a flaw in my worldview, a hairline fracture that appeared during a school trip to northern Italy in the autumn of 2009. It was the night physics failed me, and something else took over. We were a group of 20 seniors, exhausted and irritable after our tour bus suffered a blown transmission on a winding road just outside the municipality of Città di Castello. It was raining, a cold, relentless drizzle that turned the Umbrian countryside into a blur of gray and green. Because the bus couldn't be repaired until morning, our chaperones scrambled to find lodging. We ended up at a place that wasn't exactly a hotel, though it functioned as one. It was a massive, imposing stone structure called Villa dei Sospiri, Villa of Sighs. Locals later told me it had been a tuberculosis sanatorium in the 1940s, and before that, an orphanage run by a strict religious order. But on that night, to my teenage eyes, it was just a damp, drafty building that smelled of wet wool and floor wax. My roommate was a guy named Marcus. Marcus was the opposite of me. Loud, impulsive, and possessing a dangerous lack of fear. We were assigned a room on the third floor, at the very end of a hallway that seemed to stretch on forever into the gloom. The room was Spartan. 2 iron-framed beds, a heavy oak wardrobe that looked like it had grown out of the floorboards, and a single window overlooking the rain-lashed courtyard. "It smells like copper in here," Marcus said, dropping his bag. He was right. Underneath the smell of old wood, there was a metallic tang, sharp and unpleasant, like old pennies or dried blood. We settled in. The curfew was strict, doors locked, lights out. But at 17, compliance is optional. Around midnight, boredom set in. Marcus was pacing the room, tapping on the walls. He was looking for a hollow sound, a secret passage. He was joking, of course, until he wasn't. "Alex, look at this," he whispered. He was standing by the massive wardrobe. It was positioned awkwardly, slightly angled away from the corner. "There's a draft coming from behind it. Freezing cold." I walked over. He was right. A steady stream of icy air was bleeding out from the darkness behind the heavy oak. Being young and stupid, we decided to move it. It took both of us pushing with our backs against the mattress to inch the wardrobe forward. The screech of the wood against the floor was deafening, but we didn't stop until we revealed it. A small, painted-over door, barely 4 feet high. It had no handle, just a keyhole that looked like a black eye staring back at us. "We shouldn't," I said. That was my rational brain speaking. "We have to," Marcus grinned. He used his pocket knife to slide the latch. With a groan of rusted hinges that sounded like a dying animal, the door swung inward. The space beyond wasn't a closet. It was a room. This is where the memory becomes vivid, not in a hazy, dreamlike way, but with the sharp clarity of a photograph. The room was windowless and oddly shaped, like a wedge. Unlike our bedroom, which was wallpapered in fading floral patterns, this hidden chamber was clinical. The floor, ceiling, and walls were tiled in white ceramic, though the grout was stained a deep, brownish yellow. And in the center of the room, illuminated only by the flashlights of our Nokia phones, was a gurney. It wasn't a standard hospital bed. It was heavy, industrial steel, bolted to the floor. The mattress was gone, leaving only the metal frame. Thick brown leather straps dangled from the sides, restraints for the wrists, ankles, and chest. "Jackpot," Marcus whispered, the sound deadened by the tiled walls. The silence in that room was heavy. It wasn't just the absence of noise. It was a physical weight pressing against my eardrums. The air was frigid, easily 20 degrees colder than our bedroom. "Marcus, let's go," I said. My skin was prickling. Not a shiver, but a primal reaction. The piloerection of hair on my arms, my body telling me I was in the presence of a predator. Marcus ignored me. He stepped inside, his sneakers squeaking on the dusty tiles. "It's an asylum chair. Look at the scratches." He pointed his light at the floor. Deep gouges marred the ceramic around the bolted legs of the gurney, as if the heavy steel frame had vibrated violently against its anchors over years of use. "I dare you to strap me in," Marcus said, sitting on the cold metal. "No." "Come on, you coward, just for a photo. I want to show the guys back home." He lay back, the metal groaning under his weight. He pulled the chest strap over himself. "Just buckle this one. I can't reach it." I hesitated. The rational part of me said this was just an old room, just an old bed. But the smell of copper was overpowering here. It tasted like I had bitten my tongue. Against my better judgment, I stepped forward and clicked the buckle. Click. The sound echoed too loudly. "Okay," Marcus laughed nervously. "Take the picture." I raised my phone. Through the low-resolution screen, the room looked greenish, grainy. I snapped the photo. That was when the silence broke. It didn't start with a noise. It started with the strap. I was looking directly at Marcus's chest. The leather strap, which I had fastened loosely, suddenly pulled tight. It constricted with such force that Marcus let out a sharp huff of air, his eyes widening in shock. "Alex, quit it!" he wheezed. "I'm not touching it," I said, stepping back. My hands were up. I was 3 feet away from him. "Get it off! It's tight!" Marcus struggled, his hands clawing at the buckle. Then the gurney moved. It didn't roll, it was bolted to the floor, but the bolts, they screamed. A high-pitched, tearing sound of metal being ripped from concrete. The entire heavy steel frame jerked 6 inches to the left, sliding violently towards the wall. Marcus screamed. It wasn't a playful scream. It was the sound of pure, unadulterated terror. "Help me! Get me out!" I lunged forward, grabbing the buckle. The leather was cold, unnaturally cold, like dry ice. It burned my fingers. As I fumbled with the mechanism, I felt it. I didn't see a ghost. I didn't see a shadow person. I felt pressure. Something was standing right next to me. I could feel the displacement of air. I could smell a sudden, overwhelming stench of rot, like meat left in the sun, overpowering the copper smell. A weight pressed against my shoulder, shoving me aside. "Get it off!" Marcus shrieked. The gurney slammed against the wall again. Bang! The force was enough to crack the tiles. Dust rained down from the ceiling. I managed to jam my thumb into the release mechanism. The buckle snapped open. Marcus didn't wait. He scrambled off the metal frame, falling onto the floor, scrambling on hands and knees towards the tiny exit door. I was right behind him. As I turned to run, I heard the sound that haunts me to this day. It was the sound of the leather straps snapping back down onto the metal frame. Whack, 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 as if invisible limbs were being restrained again. And then a voice, not a whisper, but a guttural, wet sound right in my ear. "Mine." We dove through the small door, tumbling back into our bedroom. Marcus kicked the wardrobe. We put our backs into it, sliding the heavy oak furniture back over the opening, sealing it. We collapsed on the floor, gasping for air. The room was silent again, but the temperature was normalizing. "Did you hear that?" Marcus whispered, his face pale, sweat beading on his forehead. He was clutching his chest. "I heard it," I said. I wanted to deny it. I wanted to say it was the wind, the rusty springs. "Look," Marcus said. He lifted his shirt. Across his chest, where the strap had been, was a welting bruise. But it wasn't just a straight line from the leather. Underneath the strap mark, perfectly formed in purple and red, were the distinct impressions of fingers. 3 long, thin fingers and a thumb pressing down into his rib cage. We didn't sleep. We sat with the lights on, backs against the opposite wall, listening. For the next 3 hours, until the sun rose, we heard it. Not vague creaks. We heard the distinct rhythmic sound of metal slamming against the other side of the wall. Bang, pause. Bang, pause. It was rhythmic, deliberate, like someone, or something, was testing the strength of the barrier. The next morning, the bus was repaired. We left immediately. We didn't tell the teachers. Who would believe us? We looked like 2 hungover teenagers who had stayed up all night telling ghost stories. But the corroboration, the confirmation that sends a chill down my spine even now, came 2 weeks later. I was back home, trying to process the event, trying to rationalize the physics of the bolts ripping from the floor. I decided to research the Villa dei Sospiri. I found a forum for urban explorers in Italy. I posted a vague description of the location, asking if anyone knew about the history of the 3rd floor. A user named LocalHistorian88 replied within an hour. "You mean the isolation ward? The villa was a sanatorium, but during the late 50s, the 3rd floor was rented out to a Dr. Moretti for experimental psychiatric treatments. He believed trauma could cure hysteria. He had a soundproof room built behind a false wall in the east wing. Legend says he would strap patients down and leave them in the dark for days. He was killed by a patient in 1961. The patient managed to break the restraints, ripped the bolts right out of the concrete." I stared at the screen. The physics finally made sense. The bolts hadn't been ripped out by a ghost that night. They had been loose for 50 years, broken by a desperate human being. But the bruise on Marcus's chest? The finger marks that remained visible for a week? And the voice that claimed him? That I cannot explain with architecture. I haven't spoken to Marcus in 10 years. The last time I saw him, he was drinking heavily, refusing to be in a room with the door closed. He told me that sometimes, when he's lying in bed at night, on the edge of sleep, he feels a strap tightening across his chest. I tell myself it's PTSD. I tell myself it's the power of suggestion. But I never sleep on my back anymore. And I never, ever look under the bed. I am a man of data. As a structural analyst for Helsinki's City Planning Department, my life is governed by spreadsheets, load-bearing capacities, and historical blueprints. I do not believe in ghosts. I believe in poor insulation, settling foundations, and the infrasound caused by faulty HVAC systems. That was my dogma until the winter of 2018. I had just purchased a studio apartment in the Turlu district. It was a steal, suspiciously cheap for the area, but I rationalized it as a market fluctuation. The building was a heavy stone monolith constructed in 1951, rising from the scars of the Continuation War. It had that specific sterile smell of post-war functionalism, concrete, linoleum, and dust. The layout was efficient but odd. The previous owner had partitioned the main room, creating a windowless sleeping alcove sealed off by a heavy velvet curtain. It was a room within a room, a dark, airless box, just big enough for a double bed. I remember the first night clearly. It was November, and the darkness in Finland settles in by 3 p.m. I drew the curtain, shutting out the streetlights, and lay in the absolute pitch black. The silence in that alcove was heavy. It wasn't peaceful, it was pressurized, like the air in a submarine. At 2 a.m. I woke up, not from a noise, but from a sensation. My feet were freezing. I kicked the duvet, assuming I had left them exposed, but they were covered. The cold wasn't in the air. It was on me. It felt like a block of dry ice had been placed directly against my skin, seeping through the heavy wool blanket. Then came the smell. It was faint at first, ozone and wet ash, the smell of a thunderstorm, or perhaps an electrical fire that had been extinguished with dirty water. Old pipes, I muttered to the darkness, forcing my rational brain to take the wheel. I turned over and went back to sleep. The phenomena escalated over the next 2 weeks. It began with the drafts. The alcove was an enclosed space with no vents, yet every night a steady, rhythmic breeze would brush against my face. It was rhythmic, like the cycle of a lung. Inhale, exhale. I bought a thermal leak detector. I scanned the walls, the floor, the ceiling. Nothing. The walls were solid concrete. There was no physical source for the air movement. Then the sleep paralysis began. I have experienced paralysis before. Stress, caffeine, irregular sleep cycles. I knew the drill. But this was different. Usually, paralysis is a trick of the mind. You panic because you cannot move. In this apartment, I wasn't panicking because I couldn't move. I was panicking because of why I couldn't move. There was weight. It started at the corner of the bed. I would wake up, frozen, eyes darting in the dark, and I would feel the mattress depress, creak, shift, settle. It was the unmistakable sensation of a person sitting down on the edge of the bed. I could feel the springs groan under the mass. I could feel the duvet pull tight across my shins as the weight displaced the fabric. I would lie there, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird, waiting for the weight to shift. But it never did. It just sat there, waiting, watching. I told myself it was hypnagogic hallucinations. I was overworked. I was lonely. Then Anya came into the picture. Anya was my girlfriend at the time, a nurse, pragmatic and sharp. I didn't tell her about the nights. I didn't want to sound like a lunatic. The second-person verification rule of my life is that if no one else sees it, it isn't real. She stayed over on a Saturday night. We drew the heavy velvet curtain. We slept. I was awoken by a scream that I will never forget. It wasn't a scream of surprise. It was a primal, guttural shriek of pain. I fumbled for the light switch, tearing the curtain open. Anya was scrambling backward, pressing herself against the headboard, her eyes wide, staring at the foot of the bed. She was hyperventilating, clutching her ankle. "Who is he?" she gasped. "Elias, who is he?" "Who? There's no one here," I said, my voice trembling. The room was empty. The alcove was empty. "The man," she sobbed, pointing at the empty space at the foot of the bed. "He was sitting there. He was burned. He looked like wet charcoal. He grabbed my leg." I looked at her ankle. There, rising on her pale skin, were 4 distinct red marks. Not scratches. Burns. Friction burns, like sandpaper or rough leather had been dragged violently across her skin. The air in the alcove was freezing. My breath plumed in white clouds in front of my face. We left that night. We went to a hotel. Anya refused to ever step foot in that building again. She broke up with me 2 weeks later. She said I brought something heavy with me, a darkness she couldn't be around. I should have sold the place then. But I am a man of data. I needed to know. I returned one last time to pack my boxes. It was midday, but the apartment was dim. I was alone. I was taping up a box of books in the main room when I heard it. Creak. It came from behind the velvet curtain of the alcove. I froze. The silence that followed was deafening. Creak. Shift. The sound of the mattress springs. The sound of weight settling. I stood there, the packing tape dispenser trembling in my hand. My rational mind tried to fire its last defenses. rats, settling foundation, wind. But I knew. I walked to the curtain. I didn't rip it open. I reached out, my hand inches from the heavy fabric. Through the velvet, I could feel the cold radiating like an open freezer door. "Get out," I whispered. I felt ridiculous saying it. The response was not a voice, it was a physical action. From the other side of the curtain, something pushed back. It wasn't a wind. It was a hand. I saw the imprint of a hand press against the fabric, inches from my face. A large, broad hand, pushing the velvet outward toward me. And then, the sound. It was right next to my ear, separated only by the cloth. A wet, rattling wheeze. The sound of lungs filled with fluid. The sound of a drowning man trying to inhale. I didn't scream. I didn't investigate. I turned and ran. I left the box. I left my furniture. I left the keys on the kitchen counter, and I ran until my lungs burned in the frozen Helsinki air. I sold the apartment a month later to an investment firm. I took a loss. I didn't care. Before I signed the papers, I did what I should have done in the beginning. I pulled the original architectural records from the city archives, the ones from before the 1951 reconstruction. The plot of land didn't just house a previous residential building. During the war, in February 1944, a Soviet incendiary bomb had struck the courtyard. The blast had collapsed the basement of the original structure. The report was clinical, typed in faded typewriter ink. It listed the casualties. Recovery efforts ceased due to structural instability. 3 individuals unaccounted for, believed to be trapped in the lower coal cellar. The sleeping alcove. I overlaid the blueprints. My bed. The alcove was positioned directly over the shaft where the coal chute used to be. The void where 3 people had suffocated in the dark, crushed and burned, waiting for rescue that never came. I live in a modern glass and steel high-rise now. It has floor-to-ceiling windows, no curtains, never curtains. But sometimes, when the winter wind hits the glass just right, causing the pane to vibrate with a low hum, I can still smell it. Ozone, wet ash, and I feel the weight on the edge of the bed, settling in for the long, cold night. I deal in structures. My name is Elena, and I am a restoration architect specializing in brutalist and Art Nouveau buildings in Eastern Europe. I understand how buildings breathe, how they settle, and how they rot. I know that old pipes sing when the pressure changes, and that drafts can sound like whispering voices. I do not believe in the supernatural. I believe in physics, in acoustics, and in the history of materials. That belief system held firm until the winter of 2022. My husband, Andre, is an investigative journalist. We were in Bucharest for a week, staying at the Hotel Vitul, a pseudonym for legal reasons. It was a massive, imposing structure built in the late 19th century, then repurposed by the communist regime in the 50s. It was a place of high ceilings, heavy velvet drapes, and the lingering, stale smell of a century's worth of cigarette smoke that no amount of cleaning could scrub from the plaster. Our room, Suite 402, was vast. It had that specific, oppressive luxury you find in old European hotels, furniture that felt too heavy to move, mirrors that were slightly de-silvered at the edges. But the focal point of my discomfort was the door. To the left of the bathroom entrance, there was a secondary door. It was painted the same cream color as the walls, but the paint was thick, layered over decades, sealing the frame to the jamb. There was no handle, just a brass keyhole that had been filled with putty. "Service corridor," I told Andre on the first night. "Or a connecting room they sealed off for fire safety." I examined it with professional curiosity. I tapped the wood. It was solid oak, dense and unforgiving. But the sound was wrong. It didn't sound like it led to a hollow hallway. It sounded dead, like there was nothing behind it but earth or stone. On the third night, the atmosphere in Bucharest shifted. A heavy snowstorm blanketed the city, muffling the traffic noise outside. The hotel felt hermetically sealed. It was 9:45 p.m. Andrei was lying on the bed, reading a biography of Ceausescu, the bedside lamp casting a warm, yellow pool of light over him. I was in the bathroom, washing my face. The door was ajar, allowing me a clear line of sight into the bedroom. I was scrubbing my skin, listening to the rhythmic scratch-scratch of Andrei turning a page. Then the sound stopped. Not just the page turning. All sound stopped. The hum of the radiator died. The distant murmur of the elevator in the hall vanished. The water running from the tap into the sink. I could see it flowing, but I couldn't hear the splash. It was a pressure drop. My ears popped painfully, a vacuum forming in the room. The air suddenly smelled of ozone and wet wool, the specific metallic scent of an overheated electrical motor. I turned off the tap. My hand was trembling, though I didn't know why. My body was reacting before my mind could process the threat. I looked into the mirror, catching the reflection of the bedroom behind me. That is when I saw him. He didn't walk. He didn't float. He manifested in movement. Emerging from the solid wall next to the sealed door was a figure. He was tall, wearing a gray double-breasted suit that looked like it was cut from the 1950s. The fabric looked heavy, coarse. But he wasn't solid. He was a distortion. You know when you look at a road on a hot day and the heat haze makes the horizon ripple? He was like that. A human-shaped heat haze, a glitch in the visual field. The edges of his suit blurred into the wallpaper. But the most terrifying part was his head. He had no face. It wasn't a skull or a blank slate. It was smudged. It looked like someone had taken a wet thumb and smeared the ink of a photograph where his features should have been. A violent, swirling blur of gray and black where eyes and a mouth should exist. I stood, frozen, gripping the porcelain sink until my knuckles turned white. I couldn't breathe. The fear was primal, a lizard brain response telling me that I was in the presence of an apex predator. The figure moved across the room. It glided past the foot of the bed where Andrei lay. Andrei didn't look up. He didn't see it, but his body reacted. As the gray man passed him, Andrei shivered violently. The book in his hands shook. He pulled the duvet up to his chin, his eyes darting around the room, confused, like an animal sensing a storm. The figure didn't acknowledge him. It moved with bureaucratic purpose. It wasn't haunting us. It was simply transiting through our space. It reached the sealed door. The door with the putty-filled keyhole. The door painted shut for 50 years. The figure didn't open it. He didn't phase through it like a ghost in a movie. As he stepped into the door, the wood seemed to liquefy. The paint rippled like milk. The figure stepped into the solid matter, and for a split second, the door absorbed him. The gray suit, the smudged face, the heavy presence, all of it was sucked into the grain of the wood. And then, with a sound like a cracking whip, the silence broke. Crack! The radiator hissed back to life. The traffic noise returned. The water in the pipes groaned. I gasped, air rushing back into my lungs. I stumbled out of the bathroom, my legs feeling like jelly. "Andrei!" I choked out. Andrei was sitting up, pale as a sheet. He was rubbing his arms vigorously. "Elena," he whispered, his voice hoarse. Did the power go out?" "You didn't see him?" I asked, rushing to the bed. "See who?" Andrei looked at me, his eyes wide. "I didn't see anyone. But Elena, the light." He pointed to the bedside lamp. "For a second, the light
bent. It curved, like something heavy walked in front of it and sucked the light into itself. And the cold. God, the cold.
I looked at the digital thermometer on the wall control panel. It usually read 22 degrees Celsius. It was flashing 14 degrees Celsius. The temperature had dropped 8 degrees in 10 seconds. I walked to the sealed door. My skepticism was screaming at me to find a logical explanation. A draft, a hallucination, a gas leak. I placed my hand on the painted wood. It was vibrating. A low, subsonic hum, like a high-voltage transformer, was emanating from the wood. And it was hot. Not cold, hot. Friction heat. As if matter had been forced through matter violently. "We're leaving," I said. "Now." We packed in 10 minutes. I didn't care about the refund. I didn't care about the late hour. We checked out at 10:30 p.m. As we stood at the reception desk, the concierge, an elderly man with tired eyes, looked at our room key. Suite 402. He didn't ask why we were leaving early. He didn't ask if everything was okay. He just nodded, a look of resigned understanding on his face. "Did you hear the typing?" he asked softly. I froze. "What?" "The typing," he repeated. "Most guests complain about the sound of a typewriter, like a heavy mechanical one, tack, 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 from the next room." "There is no next room," I said, my voice trembling. "That door is sealed." The concierge leaned in, lowering his voice. "Madam, that hotel wing was the administrative office for the Securitate in the 1950s, the secret police. Room 402 wasn't a bedroom then. It was an interrogation waiting room. The door you saw, that led to the archive, the place where they typed the files of the people who were erased." He took the key. "We paint over the door every few years. The stain keeps coming back." I looked at Andre. He was pale. "The redacted man," Andre whispered. "A man with no face. A man erased." We left Bucharest the next morning. I tried to move on. I went back to my blueprints, my calculations, my concrete reality. But the physics of my world have changed. I know now that walls are not always solid. I know that silence can be heavy. And sometimes, when I am working late in my study and the house gets too quiet, I look at the door to the hallway. I check the handle. I check the lock. Because in the corner of my eye, just at the edge of my peripheral vision, I still see it. A gray blur, a smudge in reality. A suit with no man inside, waiting to step through a door that shouldn't exist. I am an architect. I build spaces for the living. But I have learned with terrifying clarity that we are merely squatters. The spaces belong to them. I am an acoustic engineer. I spend my life mapping the way sound waves interact with physical matter. I can tell you the density of a wall by the way a voice bounces off it. I can identify a structural fault in a bridge by the frequency of the wind whistling through its cables. My world is defined by physics, by the measurable, by the tangible. I do not believe in ghosts because ghosts do not generate sound waves. Or so I told myself, until the summer of 2019. There were 7 of us, a collection of high-functioning skeptics. 2 surgeons, a structural architect, a lawyer, myself, and our partners. We had rented a converted farmhouse in the Dordogne region of France, deep in the countryside, miles from the nearest paved road. The house, Le Mas de Pierre, was a fortress of limestone and oak, built in the late 18th century. It sat in a valley of absolute silence, surrounded by vineyards that stretched like veins across the dry earth. The first 3 days were idyllic. We drank local wine, ate cheese that smelled of earth and history, and marveled at the quiet. In my line of work, true silence is a luxury. The background noise of the world, the noise floor, is usually around 40 decibels. Here, it was near 0. At night, the only sound was the cooling of the stones, a soft tick, 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 as the heat of the day released into the cool French air. On the 4th night, we retired early. The wine had been heavy, the conversation rich. By 11:30 p.m., the house was dark. My bedroom was on the 2nd floor, directly above the kitchen. The floorboards were original chestnut wood, thick and gapped, allowing sound to travel with minimal dampening. I fell into a deep, dreamless sleep, the kind that only comes with total exhaustion. At 2:47 a.m., the world ended. That is the only way I can describe the sound. It didn't start with a creak or a warning. It was an instantaneous, deafening explosion of violence. Crash! It sounded as though a massive shelving unit, heavy, industrial iron, had been ripped from the wall and hurled onto the stone flagstones below. But it wasn't just metal. It was the distinct, high-frequency shattering of ceramics. Hundreds of plates, glasses, and bowls being pulverized simultaneously. The noise was so loud it felt physical, a pressure wave that hit my chest and vibrated through the mattress. It was the sound of total, catastrophic ruin. I jolted upright, my heart hammering against my ribs like a trapped bird. My wife, usually a heavy sleeper, was already sitting up, clutching the sheets, her eyes wide and white in the darkness.
"Someone's in the house," she whispered. "My God, Elias, someone is destroying the house."
The silence that followed the crash was more terrifying than the noise itself. It was a heavy, suffocating silence. No footsteps, no voices, no car engines speeding away, just the ringing in my ears. I grabbed the heavy Maglite flashlight from the nightstand. I am not a brave man, but the adrenaline of the moment overrode my logic. I opened the bedroom door. In the hallway, the scene was surreal. Every single door on the 2nd floor had opened. There we were, 7 adults, educated, rational people, standing in our sleepwear, pale and trembling. Mark, the architect, looked at me. "The kitchen?" "The kitchen," I confirmed.
"It sounded like the ceiling collapsed,"
Sarah, the neurosurgeon, said. Her voice was steady, but her hands were shaking.
"It sounded like a bomb."
We moved as a pack. This is the detail that keeps me awake at night, the shared verification. If I had been alone, I would have convinced myself it was a night terror, an exploding head syndrome episode. But 7 people heard the exact same frequency of destruction. 7 people felt the floorboards vibrate. We descended the stairs. The wood was cold under my bare feet. The air in the stairwell felt different, charged, static, like the atmosphere before a lightning strike. The smell of old dust and dry stone was intense. Mark went first, holding a fireplace poker he had grabbed from the landing. I followed with the light. "Hello?" Mark called out. His voice cracked. "We have called the police." A lie. We had no signal in the valley. We reached the bottom of the stairs. The door to the kitchen was closed. It was a heavy farmhouse door with an iron latch. We paused. I could hear the group breathing behind me, shallow, terrified breaths. We expected to open that door and see ruin. We expected to see intruders, or a collapsed beam, or the shards of our dinnerware scattered like snow across the floor. Mark nodded to me. I reached out and lifted the latch. The metal was freezing cold. I kicked the door open and I swept the beam of the flashlight across the room, bracing myself for the violence. The light cut through the darkness. The kitchen was pristine. I don't mean it was merely tidy. I mean, it was aggressively undisturbed. The long wooden table stood in the center, the runner perfectly straight. The heavy iron pot rack hung from the ceiling, motionless. Not a single pot was swinging. If there had been a physical force strong enough to cause that sound, the kinetic energy would have made the pans sway. They were dead still. We walked in, our flashlights dancing over the surfaces. The open shelves, stacked with fragile porcelain plates and wine glasses, were perfect. Nothing had fallen, nothing was chipped. The silence in that room was absolute. It was a vacuum.
"I don't understand,"
Sarah whispered, walking to the cabinets. She opened them. The glasses were there, arranged in neat rows.
"I heard glass breaking. I heard shattering."
"We all did," I said. My voice sounded flat, deadened by the room's acoustics. I knelt on the floor. The flagstones were clean. No dust, no debris. But then I smelled it. It was faint, but to a nose trained to analyze environments, it was unmistakable. Gunpowder. And underneath that, the smell of pulverized brick. The smell of a demolition site. "Mark," I said, looking up at the architect. "Check the foundation." Mark walked to the center of the room. He jumped, landing hard on his heels. The floor was solid. "Structural integrity is fine. No settling. No seismic activity. Elias, physics doesn't work like this." We stood there for an hour. 7 of us, circling the kitchen, opening drawers, checking the windows, all locked from the inside. We tried to recreate the sound. I dropped a heavy cast iron skillet onto the floor. Clang! It was loud, yes, but it was a singular metallic note. It lacked the cacophony, the texture, the sheer volume of what we had heard. It was a whisper compared to the scream of the earlier event. We eventually went back upstairs. No one slept. We sat in our rooms with the lights on, listening to the wind rise outside, sounding like a low moan through the eaves. We left the next morning, 2 days early. We didn't discuss it while packing. We just moved with a desperate, silent urgency to get away from that stone box. But the story doesn't end there. If it did, it would just be a mystery. The horror lies in the confirmation. 6 months later, I was back in Paris. The experience had gnawed at me. I couldn't let it go. I needed data. I managed to track down the property records for the domain. The farmhouse had been renovated in the 1990s. Before that, it had been a ruin for 50 years. But going back further, to 1944, I found a police report from the local gendarmerie, dated August 1944. The farmhouse had been used by the French resistance as a supply depot. They stored munitions, medical supplies, and food in the kitchen cellar. On August 14, 1944, a German patrol had raided the property. The resistance fighters, cornered and refusing to surrender their supplies, had detonated the stockpile. The report described the event in bureaucratic French. Une explosion énorme. A massive explosion. The kitchen floor had collapsed into the cellar, the shelving, loaded with ceramic jars of preserved food and glass medical bottles, had been pulverized instantly. 7 resistance fighters died in the blast. I sat in the archives, the paper trembling in my hands. We hadn't heard a ghost. We hadn't heard a poltergeist throwing plates. We had heard an echo. A traumatic acoustic event so violent, so energetic, that it had imprinted itself into the very limestone of the house. We had been inside a recording, playing back the moment of death for 7 people. I am an acoustic engineer. I know that sound waves eventually dissipate. Their energy turns into heat, into friction, into nothing. But sometimes I wonder if I am wrong. Sometimes, when the silence is deep enough and the conditions are right, I wonder if the scream of dying things ever truly fades away. I still have nightmares about that sound.
But the worst part isn't the crash. The worst part is realizing that when we went down to the kitchen, standing on those cold flagstones, we were standing in the exact center of the blast radius. And the 7 of us, we matched the number of the dead.
I am a geotechnical engineer. My life is measured in strata: topsoil, clay, bedrock. I understand what lies beneath the earth because I drill into it, sample it, and analyze its stability. I know that the ground is just layers of compressed history, and usually that history is inert. It is silent. I do not believe in bad energy. I believe in radon gas, in mold spores, and in the infrasound generated by settling foundations. But there is one survey I never filed, one site I never returned to. In the autumn of 2018, an old university friend, Lucas, invited me to inspect a property he had purchased near the Polish border, deep in the former East Germany. It was a massive Art Nouveau villa built around 1905 that had sat abandoned since the fall of the Berlin Wall. Lucas was a flipper. He bought ruins, patched them up, and sold them to wealthy Berliners looking for countryside retreats. But this house was different. He told me over the phone that the contractors were refusing to work in the basement. They claimed the air felt heavy. I arrived on a gray, drizzling afternoon. The house was beautiful but imposing. Dark stone, gargoyles eroded by acid rain, and stained glass windows that looked like bruised eyes. "It's the foundation," Lucas said, leading me inside. He looked tired, pale. "The cellar. I want to convert it into a wine cellar or a studio apartment, but just come see." We descended. The air grew colder with every step, a sharp, unnatural drop that had nothing to do with insulation. The basement was vast, with vaulted brick ceilings and a floor of packed earth and cracked concrete. It smelled of wet coal and something sweeter, like rotting lilies. I walked to the center of the room, my boots crunching on the debris. I was looking for cracks in the masonry, signs of subsidence. Then, I stepped onto a patch of earth near the north wall. It hit me like a physical blow. It wasn't a sound. It was an invasion. A sensation shot up from the soles of my feet, seizing my legs like ice water. My stomach dropped, the way it does when an elevator descends too quickly. But the worst part was the thought. It wasn't my thought. It was a violent, screaming imperative that exploded in my frontal lobe. Dig. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a biological need. I fell to my knees, my hands hovering over the dirt. The urge was overwhelming. I wanted to tear at the concrete with my bare hands. I wanted to rip my fingernails off, if that's what it took to get to what was underneath. I felt a phantom sensation of dirt under my nails, of wet, cold clay against my skin, even though I hadn't touched the ground yet. "Thomas?" Lucas's voice sounded miles away. I looked up. My hands were shaking violently. I was hyperventilating. "What is buried here?" I choked out. The words felt foreign in my mouth. "I don't know," Lucas whispered. He was standing in the doorway, refusing to cross the threshold. "But the previous owner, the records say this room was used by a society in the 1920s, and later by the Stasi." I scrambled backward, crab-walking away from that patch of earth until the sensation severed. The moment I crossed the center of the room, the urge vanished, leaving me nauseous and sweating. "Seal it," I told him. "Pour concrete over it, 2 feet thick. Don't dig. Never dig." I left an hour later. I drove back to my apartment in Berlin, 4 hours away, convincing myself it was carbon monoxide poisoning or a panic attack induced by the mold. But the earth had followed me. I live alone in a modern apartment complex. It is sterile, white, and secure. I have a cat, a Russian blue named Baxter. He is a lazy, cynical animal who usually sleeps 18 hours a day. That night, the atmosphere in my apartment changed. I was lying in bed, reading a technical journal, trying to ground myself in logic. It was 2:13 a.m. The room was silent, save for the hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Baxter, who had been sleeping at the foot of my bed, suddenly woke up. He didn't stretch, he went rigid. He stood up, his ears flattened against his skull, and he stared past me. Not at the window, but at the bedroom door. I watched him. Animals react to ultrasound, to barometric pressure. I waited for him to relax. He didn't. He let out a low, guttural growl, a sound I had never heard him make. His tail puffed up to twice its size. He was tracking something. His eyes moved slowly from the left side of the doorframe to the center, following an invisible trajectory. Then he locked his gaze on the handle. I looked at the handle. It was a standard brushed steel lever, horizontal. Click. The sound was sharp in the silence. The handle moved. It didn't just jiggle, it was pressed. I watched, my breath caught in my throat as the steel lever was pushed down, slowly and deliberately. A door handle has a spring mechanism. It requires force, about 2 pounds of pressure, to depress.
Gravity cannot do this. A draft cannot do this.
The handle went all the way down to its limit. It held there. For 10 seconds, an eternity, the handle remained depressed, as if a heavy hand was leaning on it. I sat up, gripping the duvet. "Who is there?" I shouted. My voice was thin, pathetic. The handle released. Snap. It flew back up to the horizontal position. Then, the door swung open. It didn't slam. It drifted inward, revealing the dark hallway of my apartment. The hallway was empty. Of course it was empty. I am on the 4th floor. My front door is triple locked. But as the door opened, a smell drifted into my bedroom. It wasn't the sterile smell of my apartment. It was the smell of the villa. Wet coal, rotting lilies, and freshly turned earth. Baxter hissed, a violent spitting sound, and bolted under the bed. I turned on every light in the apartment. I checked the closets. I checked the shower. I sat on my sofa with a kitchen knife until the sun came up. I never went back to the villa. I blocked Lucas's number. I couldn't bear to hear what he might have found if he ignored my advice. But I did research the history. I needed to know what had touched me. The villa had been owned by a high-ranking member of the Tula Society in the 1930s, an occultist group obsessed with blood and soil mysticism. The records were redacted, but one police report from 1946 survived in the archives. When the Russians took the villa, they found the basement floor disturbed. They didn't dig it up, they just noted that the earth was loose and stained. The report mentioned an inscription found on the doorframe of the cellar, carved into the stone.
Macht dem Bösen. Power to the evil.
I am a geotechnical engineer. I know that the earth is solid. I know that layers of sediment trap things, fossils, water, gas. But I also know that some layers are not meant to be disturbed. I still live in my apartment. I can't afford to move, but every night before I sleep, I wedge a heavy rubber doorstop under my bedroom door. I lock it, and I never, ever look at the handle after midnight. Because sometimes, even with the doorstop, I can hear the mechanism click. I can hear the spring groan under the weight of a hand that has clawed its way up from a basement 400 kilometers away. And I know, with scientific certainty, that it wants me to finish the dig.